Hello, friends. You're listening to the Outside the Walls podcast. I'm Chris Dirksen. Today, Chris Lowen and I are interviewing scholar Gary Burge about how the land of Israel, God's promises to the Jewish people, and the Palestinians all fit together. At the time of this recording, the tragic conflict in Gaza between the Israeli military and the Palestinians continues to rage. How should we as Christians feel about this conflict? Is it possible to love and empathize with both Jews and Palestinians? What could a possible solution between Israel and the Palestinians look like? What does the Bible say about the modern state of Israel? And is this the end times? We deal with all these questions and more in this interview. This conversation is jam-packed with theology, history, and information that will help you understand the Middle East better and think more wisely and Christianly about the modern nation of Israel and the Palestinians. You might even want to listen to it twice. I hope you find this conversation as enlightening, compassionate, and hopeful as we did. Hello and welcome here, everybody. We're so blessed to be joined by Gary Burge. Gary, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and what you do for a living?
Thanks, you guys. I was been looking forward to being with you all week, and I'm just really delighted that I'll be able to have a conversation with your audience. So I'm a professor of New Testament. I've been teaching for a very long time, and most of my career was in Chicago at a wonderful college called Wheaton College and Graduate School. In 2017, I moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, and here in Grand Rapids, I began teaching at Calvin Theological Seminary, which is in the Reformed tradition. And I made a major change just in the last few months. I moved from full-time down to part-time, and now I'm just working with graduate students and their doctoral programs. I was the dean of the seminary right through COVID, so you can imagine what that was like. So I'm on a very, long-deserved rest. But I'm still very active in New Testament studies, and I'm very active in the discipline that we're talking about today.
Okay. So, yes, so you are a expert, a scholar with a special interest in what the Bible has to say about the land of Israel. So can you tell us a bit about, the story of how you became interested in that particular question?
Yeah, good question, Chris. So this subject about the land and the Bible and what do we do with Israel is something that you normally do not find in people who teach New Testament studies. Let me just tell you just a little bit how this got started. So when I began teaching my first couple of years, I had a colleague who knew Jerusalem very well. And so therefore, we together started leading trips to Israel. And honestly, I took so many student trips. I've hiked all over the country many, many times. I've probably taken 25 student trips at least. I quit counting. But anyway, so after a while, you begin networking. I began getting to know the Palestinian Christians. And there are a lot of, about 10% of all Palestinians are Christians, wherever we are in the world. Anyway, so, and then what happened is that there was this uprising, this whole huge conflict in the late 1980s. And that just fascinated me. I thought, what is going on here? This is really, really intriguing. And so on one of my trips, I had a friend there, a Palestinian pastor who was a friend, and he said, you know, what you need to do is you need to get away from all the tourist stuff send your students home and stay here for an extra couple of weeks and go behind the scenes with me. That's what happened. I went behind the scenes in a city north of Jerusalem called Ramallah. No tourist ever goes to Ramallah. It's a large city. And I saw occupation for the first time in my life. I couldn't believe it. When I was taking students around, I was like 15 minutes away from this stuff. And yet, I was never shown any of this. So I came home and I began really thinking about this, and I made some more trips back there. And this pastor said to me, Gary, you've been to this country by now 10 times, but you've actually only been here once because you've done the same thing 10 times. And he said, it's only when you actually begin going behind the scenes. And he said to me, when you leave the tourist trail, then you suddenly are going to see the reality that you have inside of this country. So that's what I did. And I was befriended, very fortunately, by many Palestinian pastors all over the country from all backgrounds, from Catholic to Presbyterian to Baptist. And they began inviting me to come in and spend time with their communities And before you knew it, I was speaking at pastors' conferences, and I was teaching at a college in Bethlehem, and then in early 2000s, a second uprising began, which was really, really, really dramatic and actually really violent. And I knew that there was a story, an untold story here inside of this country that my evangelical friends back home just didn't understand. So I started working on a book. It's called "Whose Promised Land: What Christians Aren't Being Told about Israel and the
Great book.
Palestinians."
A great
Thank you.
book.
Yeah, it's been just well, I was naive, to tell you the truth, because I thought I would publish this book, and my evangelical friends would say, "Hey, look, this guy's teaching at Wheaton College. He's trustworthy," and all that. And what happened was, about half of my readers loved me, but there was another half that really did not. And they thought this was the worst thing they had ever read. And I thought, how can this be? How can we be so divided on this issue? So for the last 20 years, I've been very involved in this whole discussion inside of our Christian community. And much of it is with, a conservative Christian community that I respect and love very much. That's kind of my tribe. And so I think what dawned on me is that we have some deep misconceptions about the Palestinians, and we have some really unfortunate understanding of what the Bible teaches about all this. So that has really set me to thinking. I teach a regular class on this. I speak on this quite a bit in denominations, and I get love letters and hate mail.
Welcome to Christianity.
No, it's funny when you're a public figure, you do public things. I was warning younger people when they're starting into this. I go, here's what's coming. You're going to get hugs and slugs. I'm just making this stuff up as I go. This is really sounding pretty good.
Hugs and slugs. I got to use that.
Yes. But anyway, it's the reality. It truly is a reality. So that book, I did a second edition on it about 6 or 7 years ago. And it sells so widely. And it's because I think people sense that I'm a believer and I respect the believing Christian community. And yet I'm very gently trying to say, look, we have to understand what's going on. And if we don't, woe to us. So let's do a little homework and make sure we understand this story.
Thank you. That's a great little testimonial. Thank you, Gary. Now, many of us who've grown up in evangelicalism have only ever been, and I've been to Israel twice, but I've never gone behind the scenes. I've just done the cover tour as well. And
where we all start.
Yeah. And so many of us have only been exposed to one way of thinking, what we would think is the only legitimate Christian way of looking at it, which is, hey, the Bible promises the land of Israel to, the Jewish people. Therefore, what happened in 1948 when it became a nation was a prophesied miracle. God is on their side. And then generally what that tends to be, and I don't think people are trying to be bad at all. I'm not even, we're not critiquing that view at all, even right now. I'm just saying generally what comes with that then is often as Christians, we care very much for the Jewish people, which is good, but there's almost no empathy for Palestinian suffering and so I guess what my question to you would be, are there other legitimate Christian ways of looking at what the Bible says about the land of Israel and what happened in 1948? And can you map out, there's probably 100 different ways, but can you map out maybe a main alternative or some legitimate Christian alternatives, other ways Christians throughout history and today have thought about this that might be very different than how we Western evangelicals think of it? Yeah.
Well, Chris, as you can imagine, that's a really big question, and it can go quite a few directions. But let's just take a shot at some of the basic facts and figures, okay? First of all, let's just recognize that there's a very large Palestinian community inside of Israel. 49% of the population of Greater Israel is Palestinian, and people don't realize that. That's amazing. So this is not like a huge majority of Israeli Jews who then have this minority which is troubling them. The birth rate among Palestinians is much higher than that of the Israelis, and so therefore within one generation now, the Palestinians will be the majority in this country. Okay, that's the first thing. Second thing is that most people don't realize is that that there are Arabic-speaking Christians all over the Middle East. In Syria, about 1 million. In Iraq, it used to be 1 million, but the war has driven it down to about 500,000 or 600,000. In Egypt, it's 8 or 9 million.
Wow.
There are about 12 million Christians all over the Middle East, and generally, the Palestinian population has always been 10% Christian, and of every stripe, every denomination, anything you can imagine. So therefore. But in Israel itself, that population is down to about 2% is Christian, because the Christians are very well educated. They have a lot of connections to the West, and they can leave. So they do, because of the fighting, the tension, and the discrimination. Okay, so there is a Christian community there. So when I take my students, for instance, to Nazareth, a city that is in the New Testament, of course, but it's a large city in northern Israel today, there's a thriving, in that case, Baptist and Greek Orthodox community there. And I've got friends who are Baptist pastors in this town. So I bring in my tour group, my student group, I should say. And when we're having lunch inside of town, I just call up some of my college-age friends who are all Palestinian Christians, and they just hang out and schmooze with my students. And immediately my students say to themselves, wow, what? These people are exactly like the people back home I go to church with. In fact, I'm convinced that if I could take a group of even Canadian Christians and put them in a plane and fly them to Nazareth, can't fly there, there's no airport, fly them, get them to Nazareth, and sit them down with a bunch of these Palestinian Christians, they would say, my gosh, they are our brothers and sisters in Christ. We all are reading about Gaza right now. I mean, few people know that there are many Christian churches inside of Gaza. And they are packed with Christians who have actually decided, I prefer to die in church than to walk to southern Gaza and be killed on the road.
Wow.
So they are, so this is kind of a reality that you think, really? It rearranges my head when I suddenly discover that I have brothers and sisters in Christ living inside of this country. And that has been the most transformative network for me that I've had. So I have been I've helped organize pastors' conferences in Baghdad, Iraq, believe it or not, Damascus, Syria, believe it or not, Beirut, Lebanon, and also I've taught in the seminary in Cairo, Egypt. Anyway, so we don't even realize, get this, here's a good one. Here's a takeaway. There are 12 million Arabic-speaking Christians in the world, and that's the same number as there are Jews in the world.
Wow.
Really? You were just, it was like, what? Really?
Wow, that's crazy.
That's really crazy. We just don't think that way, but they're invisible to us. All right. So you also asked, well, what do I do with the Bible? This is a complicated subject that everyone understands would take us way beyond the scope of our time right here. So if I don't ever like to pitch my own books, but if you're looking for something, just put my name into Amazon and you'll find it.
Okay.
The other book I have is called Jesus and the Land, and it talks about the New Testament and how it handles the Holy Land. But let me just give a couple of sort of glimpses of this. The first misconception is this. We have this idea, which is a modern idea, that in the Old Testament, God comes to Abraham and his descendants and hands them a property deed. Now, somewhere at the county or at the bank, my house has a property deed, and it says who owns it. And when I pay off my house someday, Lord willing, then I guess I'm going to get this deed, this piece of paper that says it's mine. Chris, you can't get it. It's mine, period. So we have a transactional understanding of how Israel holds the land in the Old Testament. And as my old colleague and friend John Walton, very well-known Old Testament scholar, has said, there isn't a single person in the ancient world who understood it that way.
Mhm.
Not a single one. There's no evidence in the ancient Near East that anybody thought about land in that way. God never gives somebody land like that because God owns your crops, God owns the cosmos, God owns all of the land. And if you make him happy, you get to stay there. If he's your God, he owns the land and you become a tenant. Now, that's exactly what the Old Testament says. If you look at Leviticus 25, verse 23, it says there, God says, look, I own the land. You don't, Israel. You are tenants. You are renters.
Hmm.
Okay. So Israel has the right of tenancy. They can actually be a renter. They have a lease, you might say, but they don't own the land. There isn't, the ancient Near East never had that idea. So they have access to the land. Now, what that means is the owner of the land has expectations. So if you live in his apartment and you break the windows, he's going to come talk to you. So in the Holy Land, there are expectations. This is a covenant relationship with contingencies, with expectations. And so therefore, inside of the Old Testament, it says again and again and again, you have to obey the law, you have to be faithful to the covenant, you have to show fidelity to God, your God who owns this land. And if you don't, it's really gross, but I'll tell you anyway, this is now makes us PG-13. The land itself will vomit you. That's what it says in the Old Testament. The land itself will throw you up. So in other words, this land has a relationship with God, its owner. And therefore, if you are not treating God faithfully, the land can't handle you. And out you go. This is why you tithe 10% of your fields, because God gets some of his crops. It isn't as if you owe him. It's his, not yours. You're lucky you're getting 90%. So anyway, this contingency is very important. And this explains the Babylonian exile, because Israel has lived a life of faithlessness, has broken the covenant. This is the interpretation of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. It has broken the covenant. And because of that violation, they are expelled from the land. The whole book of Judges is predicated on this idea as well. Each generation has to decide if they're going to be faithful. And if they're faithful, they're going to live, a blessed life in the Holy Land. If they're not, they're in trouble. So at the end of the book of Judges, the tribes of Benjamin and Dan, they actually break with their faithfulness. And both of them are placed in jeopardy. Benjamin loses a whole lot of people they're almost killed off. And then Dan actually has to go north and loses its inheritance. Land promise, therefore, is dependent on faithfulness. The prophets say it again and again and again. Okay? All right. So if that's the case, I had to repent of this understanding I had that all those who are ethnically Jewish own a piece of paper. God signed it, I signed it, and therefore, if he goes back on this, his own character is at stake.
Wow.
And I have completely misunderstood the terms of the covenant. Completely misunderstood this. So anyway, now the catch is this. So I'm with Christians all the time who say, okay, look, there are these promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their posterity. There are all of these promises. And so isn't the modern state of Israel, therefore, have a right to this land? Now I go back to the Old Testament covenant and I say, all right, but remember who owns the land.
Right.
God owns the land. And then I say to my friends who may be in a church group, I might say to them, well, what if I told you that 85% of Israeli Jews don't even recognize the Sabbath, that don't celebrate the festivals? They do not exhibit real faith in God. What if I told you in 1948, when the country was established by Ben Gurion and his friends, when early Zionism built the state of Israel, they intentionally left God's name out of all of their foundational documents because they wanted this to be a secular state, intentionally a secular state. They described themselves as the new Jew coming out of Europe, and they had absorbed socialism fully. They were secular through and through. This is why so many ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel today, they don't recognize the state of Israel. They're glad to live there. They're glad there's a Jewish state. Like, I'm glad there's a Jewish state. But they say, this state is not a faithful state. It's this, when Messiah comes, we will have a proper state, they believe. Okay. So therefore, I have this dilemma. If I took you to Nazareth, I could introduce you to my Palestinian Christian friends, and you would just be so inspired. I could take you to Tel Aviv, Israel, a very large, very secular city, and you would swear you were someplace in Europe. And you would discover that there was such a profound disinterest in things religious that you would wonder, well, if Isaiah or Jeremiah came back to life and I took them to Tel Aviv, what would these guys say? These guys would probably say, this is not what we had in mind. It isn't. Now, and I'll finish with this because I could just go on. I teach a whole class on this. I've got 40 hours that I can give you guys, but we won't go there.
This is great, Gary. This is awesome.
Yeah, but let me just give the one last bit. Well, maybe two last bits. Okay. So when it comes to the Old Testament prophets, of course, they understand all of the land promises of Abraham. They get all of this, but they say, look, you have got to measure your faithfulness in order to have God's blessing. It's as simple as that, because you are his subjects. You don't basically go off and say, thank you for the gift, and then go about your own business. No, you are subordinate to this God who is your master. Anyway, then the prophets say, well, how do you find out? What is the test? How is it that you know whether or not you are living in faithfulness to the covenant? Well, it's your prayers, it's your belief, it's your religious practices. Yeah, certainly. The festivals, of course. Sabbath keeping, of course. But the prophets say, there's something else here. And that is, are you bringing the righteousness of God into your political life, your corporate life? How, and they say, here's the test. How do you treat the widow who's bereft? Because in this patriarchal culture, without a husband, she has no hope. How do you treat the orphan? Again, somebody who has got no family system. This is a world in which your extended family keeps you alive. So how do you treat the orphan, the familyless? For us, it would be like the street person, the homeless. Really, it's like the homeless for us. And then thirdly, how do you treat the foreigner? What? What's the foreigner? The foreigner is the non-Jew who lives inside of Israel. So therefore, the prophets repeat this again and again and again. They say, okay, so the test of your righteousness isn't just how you keep the law. It's important, but the test of your righteousness is how you treat other people who don't have access to the power you have. So again, I go back to modern Israel and I say to myself, okay, how does Israel do with these tests? They really do quite well with the orphan and the widow, to tell you the truth. They have a real social network. In fact, most Americans don't realize how socialized Israel is. I think they'd be surprised. But that's cool. That's how they want to build their country. I'm all good. I'm good with that. But the Palestinian is the alien, the sojourner, the foreigner. This is the non-Jew living inside of Israel. And so the question is, if God is watching this, is God displeased with this? And in this book that you guys refer to, I just give example after example of how the Palestinian is treated inside of this country. And for me, I think the best example of it is how an African-American would be treated in 1940s Mississippi. I can only do this. I'm sorry. I know you're in a Canadian context, but I can only do my context, but I've learned from many Canadian students.
Yeah.
that you guys get Mississippi. You guys get our deep South. And in the 1940s, things were not good. That's what life is like. So inside of the state of Israel, 2 million Palestinians have Israeli citizenship. That's amazing. And 4.5 million Palestinians are living under a military occupation inside of the country. It's incredible. Anyway, so these are the things that I discovered, you guys. And honestly, when I just spoke on this 2 weeks ago at a very large church here in West Michigan, and the room was packed. It was standing room only. We did it right after worship, and we took over the Sunday school. But half the congregation piled into this room. It was craziness. And I thought, oh my gosh, if this is a hostile audience, I'm a goner.
Yeah.
Rapt attention, huge standing ovation. And they said to me universally, and I've heard it again and again, why hasn't someone pointed this out? Why does no one really explain the Bible? We hear this stuff on TV or the radio, and we hear these one-liners about pray for the peace of Jerusalem, God's expectation of you is to support the state of Israel. And I'm like, well, no, God's expectation of us is that we live Christ-like lives, that we bring the righteousness of Christ's kingdom into this world. So we have made the modern state of Israel a political object of our affection. And this happens all over the world. It happens in Judaism. I have a good friend who's a rabbi who said in his synagogue, loving Israel has become more important than loving God.
Wow.
And he doesn't know what to do with that. It's just come to some craziness.
Wow.
Anyway, so you can tell, I mean, I'm passionate about this. I've studied it for a long time. And honestly, I just don't get why my evangelical friends don't come around on this. Most of them have not been there and seen what I've seen. They don't have friends on the Jewish and Arab side of this. I have lots of Jewish friends who feel exactly the way I feel.
So Gary, I don't want to interrupt you here at all, but I
No, need to be interrupted.
Now, I know that a lot of people are going to be asking the follow-up question. I'm sure you interact with this question all the time. But does holding this alternate view that you presented automatically make you, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish?
No.
Why or why not?
That's right. Very good question, Chris. I appreciate it. Okay, so first of all, we have to clear up some more housekeeping here. And that is, even among Jewish communities here in America, and I'm sure in Canada, they want us to be very clear about this, that Zionism, which is a political interpretation of Judaism, Zionism is different than Judaism. The state of Israel is different and from Judaism itself. And so the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and many of their leaders, they want to make sure that the world thinks Judaism and Israel are one and the same. But they're not. Large Jewish communities in the United States, like Jewish Voices for Peace, they say, don't ever do that. And the conservative Jews here are going to say, don't do that. This is a secular state. My faith is not defined by the politics of this state. So therefore, for somebody like me, I feel free to critique Israeli politics and Israel's treatment of its citizens internally and the way they treat my Christian friends, my brothers and sisters. But that has nothing to do with Judaism, because I think Judaism, like any faith, deserves respect. And I personally, given the history of the Jews in Europe, I celebrate that there is a Jewish state called Israel. I think that's wonderful. That's really wonderful. But there are many Jewish scholars today who say, but we never thought Israel would become the country it's become. We thought we were going to make a democracy here that would be filled with goodness and charity and generosity. And now it just seems like we are angry and we're doing things like this horrible genocide in Gaza. And so you can find online many Jewish intellectuals who are just so ashamed of what it's all become. So instead of a country that's just simply preserving Judaism, and that's the good mission, it has become a kind of an aggressive place that has kind of scares its neighbors. Israel is, I think, the fourth largest military in the world. And that's a country the size of New Hampshire.
Gary, I want to come back to some of the theology stuff, but first, I feel like for a lot of people who are listening to this, there might be a political hang up that might just be a block. What do you see politically as a possible solution? Like, how could it be? How could it be different? Like, two states, one state altogether. Like, how? And then we can go back to some theology. But is it even possible to be different?
Yeah. So you have what Israelis call the demographic time bomb. That just means population. And I already, as I told you, 49% of the country is Palestinian. When 1948, when the country was developed, when it was built in 1948, and the flag went up for the first time, Israel was a minority population there. So they had to push out 750,000 people. They did, by gunpoint, shove them across the border so that they could increase their population size. Well, okay, so this has led to the notion that has been the American foreign policy all along, that what we have to do is create two states. There's a Palestinian state on one side of the country, and there'll be a Jewish state on the other side of the country, and they will have real autonomy, and there will be real hopefulness. When people live without hope, they do really dangerous things. So we are going to create a Palestinian state. All right, fine and good. That's our position as a country. I'm not sure of the Canadian position. It's probably the same as the American position and Britain. So anyway, but what has happened is that in the last 20 years, Israel has subsidized illegal settlers who go into the area that was supposed to be for the Palestinians. It's called the West Bank. And we got 350,000 of them living where the Palestinians were supposed to build that state. They're like colonialists. Now, this is a violation of the United Nations Charter, the Geneva Convention from 1949. It says you cannot push a population out when you conquer it and put your own population in its place. That's a very important idea. The reason it's there is because that was what caused two European wars. So that is in violation. Now, the problem is today, nobody believes there will ever be a two-state solution. And it doesn't matter how many people in Washington say it, nobody over there believes it because there's no place to build it. Israel has confiscated so much land that is over there where the Palestinian state is supposed to be and built these huge settlements on the land that the Palestinians now have nowhere to go. So what's your next alternative? Well, your next alternative is to have one nation where everybody gets a vote. And that would be a true democracy. Everybody would get a vote, and that panics every Jewish citizen there because of the demographic time bomb that I mentioned. So how can we have a Jewish state? Well, the reality is you can't have a Jewish state. You're going to have a binational state of some kind that has Jews alongside of Palestinians somehow living together. You guys have worked out something really that I don't understand with Quebec. And it's like, what? In other words, you've got a province that has a very different political view. Am I right? Or am I just making a mess of this? But they speak French, for heaven's sakes. How can you guys keep that going? It's interesting experiment in the way they've preserved one thing and other places have preserved it another. So can we have these two side by side? Israeli Jewish citizens say, no way. We are not going to have that. Okay. All right. So there's no two-state solution. You're not going to have one state where we have that's binational. Okay. What's left? There's only two things that are left. The first is you are going to become like South Africa and you will become an apartheid state. You're going to capture all of these Palestinians and put them in camps, and then you will hold them there and surround them by your army. That's South Africa. Gaza has been that. 2.2 million people in an open-air prison. It is a prison camp. Gaza is. And it exploded in October. Okay, so if you don't want to be an apartheid state like South Africa, what's left? Well, there's only one thing that's left. And many in the current government of Israel have said this is the solution: expulsion, ethnic cleansing. So therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of them. And we're going to push some to Jordan, and we'll push some to Egypt. And that is what you're watching right now. So at first, Israel was bombing Gaza to go after Hamas. I get that. They had the right to fight because of what has happened. I get that. But if you look carefully at the bombing that has gone on, they are actually destroying Gaza. And therefore, all of these people are packed at the southern border, called Rafah. And Egypt is thinking, you're not sending 2 million people over the border. You're not going to do that to us. And today, the Egyptians are building a wall, literally building a wall. It's 13 feet tall. And they're saying, you're not going to send these. And so what you can see is this population is getting pushed up against the southern fence. And that is the fourth solution. You get rid of 2 million, and suddenly you have a strong Jewish majority.
Wow.
The whole thing is so convoluted and so horrible.
That is sobering.
Very sobering. Yeah, you have to ask. Israel has destroyed the sewage network and all of the water desalination plants in Gaza. They have destroyed every university. They have destroyed every government building, like education building, where they have all the students' records. All of them have been bombed with American bombs, by the way. 500 and 2,000-pound bombs. Why hit? Why destroy a very expensive, complex system that creates fresh water? Why do you do that? It doesn't make sense unless you're wanting to make Gaza unlivable. And so that's solution number 4. Not a 2-state solution, not a 1-state solution, not apartheid, expulsion. And we'll do it violently.
Do you have any idea of sort of your average Israeli citizen? Is this like what's happening because of an extremist government in Israel? Or is this sort of what Israelis just feel this is what we just have to do?
Very good question. Before October 7, I could have given you a very simple answer, because they were marching in the street by hundreds of thousands, because there was I guess you would have to say, a more liberal, politically liberal, we'd have to say, not religiously, but politically liberal segment that hated this government. They still hate this government. Netanyahu's popularity is down in the low 20s. It's amazing. But October 7 changed everything. The massacre on October 7 was so heinous, so terrible, so unbelievable, that it has galvanized this whole community. And frankly, I think these civilizations that are there now, they're very tribal, but now they have just hunkered down. Nobody's in the street. Everybody is angry. And so October 7 was like an existential crisis to people, the Jews. You hear them talking again and again about the gas chambers, the Holocaust. So therefore, if there is a nerve at the heart of every Israeli Jew, it's massacre. It's Holocaust. And so therefore, this thing has just changed. So I talk on the phone with my friends who are really moderate Israelis, and even they are affected by this.
Wow.
And they say, we are getting sucked into this incredible national anger, and it's so vicious, there is no end to what we might do.
Wow.
In fact, you know that right now there are some rockets coming out of Lebanon that have landed in southern Israel. So yesterday, a major Israeli general said to Lebanon, if you don't stop these rockets yourself, look at Gaza City, and we're going to crush the city of Beirut in the same way. So it is like, wow, okay, we've got some real tough talk going on here. And the Palestinian Christians and the really faithful Jews, they're like, this so violates my faith. And they're just trying to stay out of the way. It's a really sad. It's a terrible. If you love these people in this country, this story will break your heart. It will break your heart. But it isn't as simple as Israel. Modern Israel is God's people, and everything they do is righteous and all that kind of stuff. Israel has many horrible people in it, as we do. Americans like to think that Canadians don't have many horrible people, but there's wretchedness all over. Yeah. As a theologian, it's our doctrine of original sin, and sin is feral right now in the Middle East.
Wow, thank you for sharing some of this with us.
It's so heavy.
What would you say, for a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but for certain groups of Christians, this is very much tied to kind of end times and stuff. So you hear some of that chatter now too. Yeah. What would be your response to that?
Yeah, I recognize that is all over the evangelical church, and it's not just an American thing. I realize that it's all over the world, frankly. Yeah. We have always been a people who like to predict the end times.
That's true.
That's true. We have done this again and again and again. It was a medieval thing. We have always said, "Oh, this is the end of the world." Okay, so Jesus is about to come back, and of course, it doesn't happen like that. In fact, Paul in 2 Thessalonians exhorts the church: you should not be walking around with your eyes on the clouds, but you really you need to lean into the life that you have here in Thessaloniki. So what I say to my friends is, look, seriously, look at those prophecies that you are picking out and ask yourself, does this in the Middle East look like a global catastrophe? It does not. It is a regional problem. It is. The other thing I say to my friends is the television prophets that I don't like to watch. What you find them doing is you find them pulling prophecies out of the prophets of the Old Testament, right? And then putting them on today, when the first rule of Bible interpretation is always know the original context from which a saying or a verse derives. And so in many cases, these verses are all about the Babylonian conquest or something of that nature. And it's irresponsible. It is so, so irresponsible. Anyway, we have a formula, actually, that is rampant in the United States. I assume it's also true in Canada. And the formula looks like this, is that the end of times is going to begin with the return of the Jews to the Holy Land. And history is going to become worse and worse. And if we look around from the economy to disease to whatever, war, so things are going to be worse. It's a depressing view of history. So history will decline. And then what will happen is that the church will be raptured. We are going to be lifted into heaven, lifted out to meet Christ. And then a 7-year tribulation is going to take place in which literally all hell will break loose inside of the world. And then Christ is going to come back in his second coming. He's going to put a stop to the fighting. He's going to protect the state of Israel. And then he's going to begin the judgment and the millennium. Does this all sound familiar to anybody?
Oh, very familiar.
Yeah. Everything that I just described to you is a fabrication. This began in the early 20th century with an Irish evangelist, and it is represented today in a sort of a worldview called dispensationalism. And honestly, right now, I don't even know any scholars who really still think that makes any sense. But this has been ingested by good Christians in the church. And I just don't get it. Take one. I have a standing offer at Wheaton College where I taught $100 to any student who can show me where the Bible teaches there will be a rapture followed by the tribulation. It's a standing thing. My whole career at Wheaton. And that's all. I had 5,000 students in class over the years. I still have my $100. It's just not. It just isn't there. And you think, how did I get that? I took that in when I was in college personally. I read a book called Hal Lindsey,
Yeah.
Late Great
I read
Planet
that too,
Earth.
by the way.
Oh
Yeah.
no, it's still out there. Anyway, and I thought, well, I guess that's true, until I was in a seminar with a number of my college students, and I had them all read it. They had to buy it, they had to read it. But my rule was you had to look up in the Bible every verse he actually points to. And they were shocked. They had read or they had heard these verses, but they had never looked them up.
Hmm.
And when they were done, they said, this is not compelling. This makes no sense. And we don't buy it. I said, well, look, okay, you've read a book that's wrong. So what's new?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had a really funny ceremony. One guy came up with it. He said, I've never thrown a book away before that I actually bought. And so they rolled the trash can up to the desks and they all pitched the book into the trash can. It's really funny. I said, wow, that is symbolic. You guys get your books and take them home so you'll remember this moment. But they wanted to say, I always assumed when I heard a pastor, everything was true. When I heard an evangelist on TV, it was always true. If I read it in a book, it's got to be true. It's in a book.
Exactly. Yeah.
We live like that. And books are my job. Books are what I do. And it just ain't so. People will publish things that are absolutely incorrect.
Mm-hmm. So Gary, if I can just shift gears here a little bit and just talk a bit about the way that maybe you can kind of first talk a bit about how the Old Testament prophecies, if you call them prophecies, regarding the Old Testament and the land, and then talk a bit about how the New Testament then referred to those prophecies.
Oh, Chris, you are like my favorite person now.
Well, that's good.
Well, because I think, look, I'm not Jewish. I'm Christian. You know, my spiritual ancestry goes back to Abraham. I get that. I'm reading Galatians. I get that. Abraham is my father. So I'm a Christian. So therefore, I want to think Christianly about this. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is why I wrote Jesus and the Land. That's what that book does. But let me just sort of summarize it like this. So we do have in the prophets this expectation that there will be a new chapter written in Israel's history. It's after the exile. Ezekiel especially talks a great deal about this. Malachi talks about this. And so in the centuries after the Old Testament, say 300 BC, 200 BC, 100 BC, if you had asked the average Jew, are we living into our prosperity? Have we arrived? And they would have said to you, we haven't really arrived. Because after the exile, you know, the Persians had us, then the Greeks had us, and now the Romans are sitting on top of us. Where's our freedom? Where's the promised land for us? And so they actually talked about still being in exile. Huh. Isn't that funny? They used it as a metaphor to say that we are living still in this hopelessness. Okay. Now, this is the central message of the New Testament. The central message of the New Testament is that chapter the prophets all were expecting. The chapter has turned, and now we are going to tell you how this is going to be fulfilled in a manner you didn't expect. So therefore, that's why Jesus begins, and throughout the Gospels, his main theme isn't, I'm dying on the cross, get your sins forgiven. The main theme is, over 90 times, the kingdom of God is coming, and it is now arriving. So therefore, what the New Testament announces is that there is this new reality which is being born in the world, and it's going to be a messianic kingdom. And that messianic kingdom does not have political boundaries, but instead it has a spiritual community. And here's the big one. It is a fulfillment of what the prophets were expecting. So that is why in the New Testament, the prophets are quoted again and again, because the New Testament is saying Messiah has arrived, and that reality you had hoped for, this reality is not what you expect. Jesus is rewriting the script. Because in the Old Testament, Isaiah says this very clearly, God's project to establish a political entity called Israel ended in catastrophe. But God's project in Jesus is to lift us above these secular political aspirations and bring us into a kingdom which is no longer defined by armies and governors. So Jesus, I'll just do two parables and I'll show you how this works out. Inside of Isaiah 5, there is probably his most important parable. In Isaiah, he says the parable of the vineyard. And he imagines, well, Israel is like a beautiful vineyard, and God built this vineyard, put a wall around it, put a great press in it. It's a beautiful vineyard. And Israelites are like grapevines which were carried out of Egypt and planted in God's vineyard. It's beautiful. So you're in the vineyard, you're cultivated, you're going to give beautiful grapes. The problem is, wild grapes begin to grow, and the grapes are of no use to anyone. So what is God going to do? Isaiah says God's going to come, destroy the vineyard, and give it to somebody else. Wow, really? Yes, the vineyard will be destroyed. That's the Babylonian army. Okay. In Mark 11, Jesus tells the same story. It's the parable of the vineyard and the tenants. Remember, tenants, those are what you call people who live in the Holy Land, tenants. And therefore, messengers come and say, could we have some of the yield? Because the owner of the vineyard wants some grapes, some wine. And they say, forget it. Then the owner sends his son, and what do they do to the son? They kill him and throw his body over the wall. Oh. So what is the owner of the vineyard going to do? He's going to come and destroy that vineyard and give it to others. Jesus is retelling Isaiah's story. So apparently, God's project, he's not interested in building this vineyard. Instead, he wants to make sure that he builds what he wants and he has his claim on it. Here's the last one. In John chapter 15, Jesus says, I am the vine, you're the branches. Okay, we all know that. Chris has preached on it more than once, I'm sure. Here's the imagery. In the Old Testament, my aim in life is to be that vine planted in the Holy Land, and my roots will go deep into the tradition of Israel. Yes, I'm planted in the land of Abraham. We'll have a wall built around us. That's my worldview. Jesus knows the story about Isaiah 5, and he does another riff on this. So then what Jesus says is, well, I am the true vine, and gentlemen, the question is not, are you planted in the vineyard, the Holy Land? The question is, are you attached to me? So therefore, the only vine rooted in the Holy Land is Jesus. There's only one vine now. And your aspiration needs to be grafting into Christ, not acquisition of Holy Land. So you can see the New Testament is upending all of this imagery. And you can imagine if you were a Jew listening to this, you would think, oh, this is not what I was taught in Sabbath school. Are you kidding me? So the New Testament is really changing around a lot of this imagery and making an announcement. The whole book of Acts is based on this. I show it in that book, that the project of God in history is not the same as the political aspirations of Israel. That the kingdom of Christ is a kingdom of heaven. And therefore, those of us who define our faith through a political enterprise really are missing the whole message of the New Testament.
Gary, we have enjoyed this time. You have given us lots of rich biblical, food and historical and political food for thought here. We so appreciate this time. I would love to have another conversation with you at some point again in the future.
Love to visit you guys in Canada sometime. Well, thank you very much for having me. I think it would be great to be back with you anytime you would like. I didn't say this, but the church that I work for, Calvin Seminary, is a two-nation church. It is both Canadian and American. And so therefore, our seminary is filled with Canadian students.
That's amazing.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah, we have a Canadian flag in our parking lot up on a pole.
Oh, fun.
Fantastic. Thank you again.
All right.